Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, you are walking across St. Peter's Square, broad stone beneath your feet, the sun washing over white marble and looming colonnades. Tourists take photos, pigeons cluster near fountains, nuns drift by in silent pairs, and the dome of the basilica casts its slow-moving shadow. But beneath it all, under centuries of Christianity, lies a hill that once terrified the Romans, not because of what it was, but because of what it held. Before the Vatican was the heart of Catholicism, it was the edge of everything. Long before there was a church, long before Peter was buried, long before Constantine lifted a finger to build his basilica. This place was known as the Ager Vaticanissa, flat stretch of land beyond the Tiber, outside the city's protective walls. To the average Roman, it was a place of an easy emptiness. Fog drifted in from the river. The soil was heavy. The air sat thick and unmoving. And those who died in disgrace were brought here to be forgotten. It was not a place for homes. It was not a place for prayer. It was a place to lose things. The name Vaticanus itself hints at forgotten meanings. Some say it came from the Etruscan god Vaticanissa, deity of prophecy, whose name whispered through the mouths of infants at birth. Others argue the name comes from Vaticinium, meaning prophecy, or Vates, a seer, a hill where visions were said to be seen, or perhaps heard, by those mad enough to listen. But by the time of Augustus, it had become something else entirely. A graveyard, not a formal necropolis, not the marble-lined cemeteries of the nobility that dotted the Appian Way. The Vatican Hill became a burial ground for those who couldn't or shouldn't be remembered. The poor, the enslaved, the actors and prostitutes, the unlicensed gladiators, the followers of mystery religions, and eventually the Christians. It wasn't planned. Rome didn't design this place. It simply grew from neglect because Roman law forbade burials within the city walls. Bodies had to be interred beyond the Vatican Hill, lying just west of the river and technically outside the city. This became a convenient dumping ground for the forgotten. You have to imagine what this land once looked like. There were no palaces, no churches, no bells, just dusty footpaths winding past crude headstones and open-air pyres, with family members kneeling in weeds to place oil lamps beside limestone graves. These lamps are still found today, some shaped like fish, others shaped like shells, many with soot-blackened mouths, burned so often that the clay itself turned charcoal. In some places, the graves were marked. In most, they were not. But deeper still, beneath the older soil, archaeologists found something stranger. Mass graves. Not carefully arranged tombs, but wide pits where bones were stacked like firewood. No order, no inscriptions, just hundreds of bodies laid atop each other, over and over, layer by layer. Some were burned, others were not. Some bore signs of violent death, others didn't. But what they all had in common was this: they were buried here because no one else wanted them, and perhaps, even more chillingly, because they belonged to the people the empire wanted to disappear. As early as the 1st century BCE, this hill attracted the outcasts of Roman religion. The cult of Cybele's rites were considered foreign and disturbing by the Senate. Held secret initiations here. Mithric temples carved into the hillside drew young soldiers, each initiation sealed in darkness with blood. Small altars to Egyptian gods Isis, Serapis dotted the margins, surrounded by animal bones and broken amphorae filled with ash. Rome tolerated religions, many of them, but it did not tolerate unapproved memory. So the Vatican Hill was left to those who remembered in secret, whose dead were mourned by whispers, and then sometime around the 60s CE. A man was crucified here, not just anywhere but near the circus grounds built by Caligula and expanded by Nero, where wild beasts and executions entertained the Roman crowd. The man's name was Simon, called Peter. He died inverted by his own request, head down, his feet up, because he claimed he was not worthy to die as his teacher had. And though the crowd jeered and moved on, few followers stayed behind, not to retrieve the body. That wasn't allowed. Crucifixion victims were often left to rot, picked clean by vultures, but they remembered the spot. They returned, not with fanfare, not with tombstones, but with a small, quiet burial, perhaps a niche, cut into the rock, perhaps a pile of stones, somewhere near where the hill curved downward toward the Tiber. In time, they marked it not with grandeur, but with subtle symbols: a fish, a key, a name scratched in haste on a piece of tile. There are records scattered, obliqued, pilgrims coming to this place even before Constantine. They came not because it was holy, but because it was hidden, because what Rome buried here was memory, and memory, once buried, does not die. It waits beneath the soil. It waits beneath the laughter of festivals and the blood of lions. It waits beneath broken, fearing, and defiled graves and toppled altars to forgotten gods. And when Constantine finally built his basilica, he did not choose the site for convenience. He chose it because the Christians told him, this is where he is, not in the city, not in some grand temple, but here, where Rome threw its bones, where it thought no one would return. Constantine had to dig through centuries of ruin just to find the right slope. Had to level the hill, fill the slope with debris, and raise up walls above the most fragile of memories. Even today, below the altar of St. Peter's Basilica, you can walk into the Sca Viva, excavated necropolis, sand-fine tombs older than the church, older than the emperor, older even than Peter. The hill remembers. It remembers the butcher and the baker. It remembers the foreign woman who brought her son's ashes in a jar. It remembers the nameless slaves who lit candles for each other at night. It remembers being forgotten, and that might be the most sacred thing of all, because buried beneath the grandest church in Christendom is not just one man. It is a city of the silenced, a memory Rome tried to erase, but that faith kept whispering back into the world. What else might be buried under their under layers of marble and doctrine and centuries of stone? You descend slowly, one cautious step at a time. The air becomes cooler, not from wind, but from depth and ancient, settled stillness that clings to stone and skin alike. The light narrows to a tunnel of dim yellow bulbs strung along the low ceiling. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica, below centuries of worship, pilgrimages, and sermons, lies something far older, a city of the dead, a Roman necropolis, untouched by sunlight for almost 2,000 years. But this wasn't a grand cemetery, not the kind designed to honor senators or emperors. These tombs belonged to merchants, freedmen, potters, midwives, and retired soldiers, people whose names never entered the records of power, but whose bones ended up beneath the most powerful church in Christendom. It started with a narrow street when archaeologists first explored the Vatican necropolis in the 1940s. During excavations, secretly ordered by Pope Pius XII, they were shocked to discover an intact Roman burial road running beneath the foundations of the basilica. Tombs were arranged in tidy rows along both sides, exactly as they would have appeared in the first 3 centuries CE. Family mausoleums stood close together, each entrance marked with painted frescoes, Latin inscriptions, or sometimes simple symbols carved into brick. It was a world no one had expected to find. Some tombs had stairs descending to underground vaults with shelves for urns. Others had niches for full-body burials. The poor were buried in earth pits, barely marked. Middle class had box graves lined with tile. The relatively wealthy had miniature rooms with mosaic floors and stucco ceilings that still held color when uncovered, and each tomb told a different story. Here, a baker's family. The inscription reads, "To Julia, my beloved daughter, may you sleep in peace." Her age is listed, 19 years, 4 months, 2 days. There, retired Roman centurion named Gaius Flavius with his wife and 3 sons, all commemorated with relief carvings of ships and laurel wreaths. Below the sculpture, his proud epitaph: he served 22 years and kept order on the Rhine. He feared no Gaul. In another, a woman named Aurelia rests beside her sister and their shared husband. Complex arrangement, but not uncommon in an empire where family was often more legal than emotional. And then, tucked behind a narrow wall, archaeologists found something quieter. A tomb with fish carved into the plaster, a single oil lamp, few Greek letters scratched into the wall. Ichthys, a coded Christian reference to Christ. Not bold, not defiant, but hidden. This tomb dated to the late 2nd century. By this time, Christians were still illegal, but they were everywhere, quietly, carefully. They weren't building churches. They were gathering in homes, meeting at night, burying their dead in ways that tried to whisper rather than shout. You wouldn't know it from the grandeur above. But the original Christian presence under the Vatican was small. In a city filled with hundreds of gods and cults, Christianity was just one more shadow belief clinging to the margins. And yet, through resilience, tragedy, and memory, it would eventually eclipse them all. And it began with graves, because where you bury your dead, you bury your identity. Romans knew this deeply. That's why even their funerary architecture had meaning. Tombs weren't just places of decay. They were visible records of family, trade, and belief. That's why they placed them along roads, so that travelers would see the names and remember. But Christians weren't allowed visibility. Their early tombs had to be disguised beneath other names, inside family crypts, or in lower levels of mixed necropolises. A fish instead of a cross, a palm branch instead of a crucifix, name scratched behind plaster. This was survival through subtlety. It is likely that the tomb of Peter, if the tradition is true, was one such place by the late 100s. Early pilgrims were writing about visiting the Tropiana small monument, maybe just a niche with a shrine, near the place Peter was said to have died. It was not large. It was not glorious, but it was known in whispers, and those whispers grew by the early 300s. When Constantine took power and legalized Christianity through the Edict of Milan, Christian leaders told him, "This is the site. Beneath this hill lies the memory we have kept. Build here, and you will be building on our greatest loss and our greatest hope." Constantine didn't just build on top of the site. He transformed it. He ordered the leveling of the entire hilltop, an enormous engineering task. Mausoleums were buried. The necropolis street was filled with rubble. Great retaining walls were built to support the raised platform. The Constantinian basilica was erected above the supposed grave. But, this is important, he left the grave intact. In a strange moment of historical humility, the builders created a small cavity beneath the high altar, surrounded by marble and red porphyry, which allowed pilgrims to reach down toward the dirt. It was called the confessio, from confiterie to confess. Here they knelt, reached in, and touched the memory of Peter, not his bones, but the earth. They didn't need proof. They needed presence. It was only centuries later that the church would try to locate his remains. And in the 1940s, as part of Pius XII's secret dig, archaeologists did find something, a small niche buried deep beneath the altar within an ancient wall. Inside, a box, and within that box, bones. A man in his 60s, broad build, from the 1st century, but no skull, no feet. Was it Peter? No one could be sure. There was no inscription. No DNA test could confirm it. Hey, and yet there was something else. Along the red plaster nearby, a message, scratched in haste by an unknown hand. Petros Eni. Peter is here. Not carved for show, not meant for tourists. Just a message, okay? A whisper from centuries past. The Vatican eventually declared them to be the relics of Peter. Whether they are or not doesn't really matter. What matters is this. Someone remembered. Someone carried that memory through persecution, through decay, through rebuilding and ruin and imperial transformation. And today, thousands walk above each unaware that beneath their feet lie layers of stone and memory, broken pottery and scorched soil, and fish-shaped lamps, and the silent bones of people no one remembers by name. So what else lies hidden? Archaeologists estimate that only a portion of the Vatican necropolis has been explored. Much of it remains sealed under solid stone and inaccessible foundations. Digging deeper risks collapse. Many of the tombs were destroyed during Constantine's construction. Others were reburied in the 16th and 17th centuries during renovations by Michelangelo and Bernini, and some were likely never documented at all. But small clues still emerge. A tile fragment here, a broken amphora there, pieces of gold thread suggesting a burial gown, beads of glass that once adorned a child's neck, coins placed in mouths for Karen's fee, and every once in a while, names scratched hurriedly into the soft mortar, barely legible after 2 millennia. It might say, Lucia lived 9 years and loved flowers. It might say, forgive me, I tried it. Might say, nothing at all, just a symbol, a crescent, a star, a key dot. All these rest quietly beneath the basilica, beneath the gold ceilings and incense and PayPal rituals. They are not spoken of during Mass. They are not listed in tourist brochures, but they are there. They always were. And perhaps that's the lesson, that before there was glory, there was grief. Before there was empire, there was loss. Before the marble was laid, before the dome rose, before the altar shone under sunlight, there was a simple hill covered in dust and sorrow, and it remembered what Rome tried to forget. So the question lingers. How much of the church's foundation, literal and symbolic, is built not on triumph, but on buried silence? And how many more voices still wait in the dark, beneath stone and time, hoping to be heard again, be heard again? You climb back toward the surface slowly, almost reluctantly, and with each step upward through the crypt passages beneath St. Peter's Basilica, the past begins to vanish behind polished stone. The cool earth turns to carved marble, patina. Tomb alleys become sweeping chapels. And eventually, you emerge into the grandeur that millions come to see each year. But you're not quite in the open. Not yet. You're in the Confessio, the sunken shrine in front of the altar of St. Peter's Basilica. Steps descend from the main floor, flanked by golden lamps. Below the shining dome, beneath Bernini's twisting bronze canopy, is a quiet chamber of red porphyry, marble columns, and iron grills. Pilgrims kneel here. Some weep, so reach through the bars to press their fingers against the glass that separates them from what lies below. It's called the Tomb of St. Peter. But this spot, this monument, this shrine is only a small part of the larger secret, because directly underneath this sacred space lies the ancient necropolis, once bathed in the Roman sun, later swallowed by Constantine's architects, and now buried in layers of cement and reverence. What does it mean when a basilica is built upon a grave? More than a symbolic gesture, it was a practical one too. Early Christians venerated martyrs, They believed their souls remained close to their bones, The closer you were to a martyr's tomb, the closer you were to grace. This idea was so powerful that wealthy patrons requested to be buried near Peter. Even popes followed this logic. The earliest were laid as close as possible to the tomb, creating a tight cluster of graves in the underground levels. But few knew the full scope of what they were standing on. By the Renaissance, the memory of the ancient necropolis had faded. Generations passed, believing that the basilica sat neatly on top of Peter's tomb and little else. In reality, the Constantinian builders had entombed dozens, maybe hundreds of others along with him. It wasn't until the 20th century that this truth began to resurface. In 1939, Pope Pius XI died. He had requested burial in the grottos under St. Peter's. During preparations for his tomb, workers accidentally broke into a hollow space. It wasn't part of any known chamber. When experts entered it, they realized they were standing in a sealed corridor, and on either side, row after row of brick mausoleums, decorated with faded frescoes, mosaic floors, and inscriptions. The Vatican called for secrecy. The world was entering war. Rome was in a fragile position under Mussolini, and this discovery, if misinterpreted, could cast doubt on the Church's authority. So Pope Pius XII ordered a quiet, systematic excavation. Over the next decade, a team of archaeologists, priests, and workers carefully opened chamber after chamber. They realized quickly this was no ordinary graveyard. It was the heart of a pagan Roman necropolis. Many tombs were older than Peter's death. They held cremation urns, a tradition phased out by Christians who favored full body burial in expectation of resurrection. Some tombs had been reused over centuries. Bones were removed, placed in niches, or accidentally scattered by floods. A few were bricked shut and forgotten altogether. The deeper they dug, the more they found. One mausoleum had a fresco of the god Mercury leading souls to the underworld. Another depicted the banquet of the dead, the refrigerium, where families would symbolically feed their ancestors. Pipes extended from the surface into some tombs, allowing wine or honey to be poured directly onto the grave from above. A ritual that blurred the line between presence and absence, body and memory. And yet, mid these pagan images, Christian symbols began to emerge. The fish, the anchor, the chiro, a figure carrying a sheep, the good shepherd, painted onto a crumbling wall. Names began to sound familiar. Onesimus, Priscilla, Lucius, Claudia, common names from Paul's letters. Probably not the same individuals, but the repetition hinted at growing Christian communities. They discovered one wall that had been rebuilt several times, the graffiti wall, as it became known. Layer upon layer of scratched messages in Greek and Latin, most nearly illegible, overlapped in chaotic disorder. Pilgrims, over generations, had come here and left marks, a finger drawn in dust, a name scratched in passing, a prayer etched in shaky script, and in one corner, Petros Eni, Peter is here. It wasn't a declaration, it was an affirmation, some memory passed down quietly through the years, outlasting the persecutors and the firestorms, and even the empire itself. But what of the bones? They were not found in an elegant sarcophagus or behind a golden reliquary. They were in a niche, tucked behind the graffiti wall, inside a simple box. When researchers opened it, they found the remains of a man in his 60s, robust, with signs of age and possible trauma to the feet. Strangely, the feet were missing entirely. Some speculated this matched the story of Peter's upside-down crucifixion, that removing the body afterward would have required severing the feet. Or perhaps the bones had been redistributed as relics in the early centuries. The Church was cautious in its conclusion. In 1968, Pope Paul VI announced that the bones had been identified in a manner we believe convincing as those of Peter. He didn't say confirmed. He said convincing. That subtle phrasing preserved the mystery. The relics were placed in a bronze box, sealed with wax, and stored beneath the altar, not to be displayed, but to be revered in silence. The Vatican opened part of the necropolis. 2 guided tours decades later, but access is still limited. Only a small portion of the site has been excavated. Most remains under tons of marble, cement, and ceremony, and perhaps that's fitting, because the basilica doesn't just stand on top of bones. It contains them. It is filled with them. Every chapel has a reliquary. Every altar has a saint beneath it. The very walls of the church absorb the dead. Crypts line the corridors. Papal tombs crowd the sublevels, and behind every candlelit prayer, there's a shadow of someone who once knelt here and was later buried just steps away. Visitors today rarely think about this. They crane their necks to admire Michelangelo's dome. They marvel at Bernini's columns. They gather for mass, unaware that beneath their feet lie the remnants of entire families. Some forgotten, some revered, and some only recently rediscovered. It is a paradox of sacred space. The higher it rises, the deeper it buries. And so we're left with questions. How much of the grandeur we celebrate was built on silence? What stories were erased to make room for the legend? And if Peter had known what would one day stand above his resting place, the basilica, the marble, the popes, the golden altar, would he have approved? Or would he have knelt quietly among the graves, beside the midwives and potters and widows, and chosen to stay there? There is no answer, only the weight of time. But as you exit the basilica, passing through the soaring nave and into the sunlit square, you carry something with you now, a knowledge not found in guidebooks, a quiet memory beneath the marble, that beneath every glorious monument there is dust. Hey, beneath every triumph, a grave, a grave. Before the Christian world claimed dominion over the 7 hills of Rome, before the ringing bells of basilicas replaced the chants of forgotten gods, there was another story unfolding deep below the surface, a story of torches and stone, of blood and mystery, and of a deity now so little understood. He exists only in fragments. We begin not above ground, but beneath it, in a dark chamber under the modern city, hidden for centuries, as if Rome herself was reluctant to admit what lay in her foundations. A Mithraeum, a temple to the god Mithras. Not many travelers to Rome hear this name. It's not spoken from the pulpit. It's not found in most history textbooks. And yet, Mithras was once worshipped by thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, throughout the Roman Empire, particularly by soldiers, merchants, and lower-level civil servants. Not the emperors, not the senators, not the elite, but the beating, marching, building heart of the empire. So, how did a Persian-inspired cult take root beneath the streets of what would later become the center of Catholic Christianity? To answer that, we must go back to the 1st century CE, when the empire was expanding fast, not just in territory, but in complexity. Soldiers were stationed at distant frontiers. Bureaucrats managed provinces from North Africa to Britain. With this mobility came spiritual hunger, a desire for belonging, initiation, and meaning in a world that was increasingly cold and impersonal. The cult of Mithras offered all that, and more. There was no public temple, no mass ritual. Instead, the rites of Mithras took place in subterranean chambers, often carved into rock or hidden beneath buildings. These Mithraea were designed to evoke a cave, not just as a nod to the legend of Mithras, but to sever worshippers from the noise of the world above. Only men were admitted. Initiation was secret, staged in progressive levels, with symbolic deaths and rebirths. The iconography was fixed, always centered on a single, strange image: Mithras, a youthful figure in eastern robes, slaying a bull. His face is serene, the bull powerful but yielding. A dog and a snake drink the bull's blood. A scorpion pinches its genitals. The whole scene unfolds under a starry canopy, often with the sun and moon watching silently. No one fully knows what it meant. Not now, not then. But to those who came down into the torchlit gloom, men hardened by war, worn down by roads, or Alienated by the old gods of Olympus, it meant something powerful. It was a promise, a transformation, and it was happening in the shadows, even as early Christianity was struggling to find its footing. In fact, for a brief time, the two faiths overlapped, not in doctrine, but in geography. Some scholars believe that during the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, there were as many Mithraea as Christian gatherings in Rome, and while Christian communities met in private homes or catacombs, the cult of Mithras claimed space beneath existing buildings, often quite literally underneath temples or houses devoted to other gods. One of the best preserved, Mithraea, in Rome, lies directly beneath the Church of San Clemente. If you walk into San Clemente today, it seems like any other Roman church. Beautiful, old, but not especially remarkable compared to the grandeur of St. Peter's or the Lateran Basilica. But descend the stairs, and you'll enter an earlier church built centuries before the one above. Keep descending, and you'll arrive at a 1st century Roman house. And finally, at the bottom, a narrow, arched chamber, dimly lit, with remnants of plaster still clinging to the walls. This is the Mithraeum. Here, Mithras slays the bull in a faded fresco. A stone bench lines each wall, where initiates once sat shoulder to shoulder. The altar remains scarred, silent, but unmistakably sacred. And for a moment, in the stillness, you feel the presence of something old, not evil, not forgotten, just buried. The layers of San Clemente illustrate a broader truth. Rome is not a city built on top of its past, but one built out of its past. When Christianity rose to power, it didn't always demolish what came before. Sometimes it built directly above it, absorbing the sacred spaces of earlier faiths, not to honor them, but to erase and replace them. But that erasure was never complete. In 274 CE, Emperor Aurelian, who had flirted with various cults during his military career, declared Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, as the official state deity. Some historians believe this was a way of unifying the fragmented solar and mystery cults, including Mithraism. Others argue it was a final attempt to hold back the tide of Christian expansion. Either way, it didn't last. By the early 4th century, Constantine the Great had converted to Christianity. The Edict of Milan legalized the new faith, and within decades, Christianity was not just tolerated, it was triumphant. The Mithraea went dark. Some were sealed, others repurposed. A few were lost entirely, their entrances blocked, their altars desecrated. And yet, the ideas, or at least the architectural memory, lingered. There is debate among scholars about whether Christian rituals borrowed from Mithraic ones. The similarities are tempting. Both involve ritual meals, initiations, symbolic death and rebirth, and a savior figure. Both emphasized personal transformation over public ceremony. And both operated in a Rome where the old gods of the capital seemed increasingly distant. But the church has always insisted Christianity did not copy the mysteries. It replaced them. Even so, some church fathers wrote defensively about Mithras, warning believers not to be swayed by its secret rites or symbols. Tertullian, writing in the 3rd century, referred to the devil as a mimic of God, accusing Mithrasis of parroting the Eucharist. Others tried to explain the appeal of Mithraism as a demonic imitation designed to confuse the faithful. But perhaps it wasn't imitation. Perhaps it was simply parallel searching to spiritual languages, speaking to the same human need for meaning, ritual, and belonging. And now, centuries later, it is the Christian churches that stand above. Their domes soar, tearing, their bells ring, and beneath them in silence, Mithras remains, not as a rival, not as a threat, but as a whisper of what Rome once was, of what it needed and what it buried. What happens to a God when no one remembers how to pray to him? There is a chill in the air when you descend into the Mithraeum, not from the stone alone, though the walls were thick and the vault low. It is the kind of chill that suggests silence, secrecy, a deliberate separation from the world above. This space, as humble as it might seem now, was not an afterthought of Roman religion. It was central, but to a different kind of faith. This was the hidden church of Mithras, and though he is forgotten today, his worship was not small, not marginal. From the 1st to the 4th century CE, Mithraism spread like wildfire, not by the rich or the powerful, but through the ranks of Rome's most loyal soldiers, customs officials, tax collectors, merchants on long roads, and workers of grain stores and granarii. It was a religion of men in the margins, and of men on the march. To be initiated into the mysteries of Mithras was not merely to believe, it was to transform. This was not a public ritual, a festival and feast like those of Jupiter or Venus. No triumphal parades or temple sacrifices where the whole city watched. No, Mithraism was private, esoteric. It took place in the dark, by torchlight, with rites spoken in whispers. A man did not walk into the Mithraeum as himself and leave unchanged. He passed through 7 grades of initiation, and with each level, he became something else. The ranks were not symbolic alone, okay? They shaped the identity and hierarchy of the community. They were 1. Corax, the raven, the 1st grade, a newcomer still shrouded in mystery. The Corax served the meals during rituals, symbolizing humility. His association with the raven, a messenger of the gods, hinted at his role as an observer and learner. 2. Nymphis, the bridegroom. K. The initiate was figuratively wed to Mithras, symbolic death to the former self. Some believe the Nymphis wore a veil during initiation, further underlining the transition between identities. 3. Miles. The soldier, now a servant of Mithras in the truest sense. He swore vows, likely of secrecy and loyalty. The sword and helmet became his symbolic gear. Hint, this grade may have involved physical trials, testing, endurance, commitment, and obedience. 4. Leo, the lion fire rituals, cleansing. The Leo participated in sacrificial rites and perhaps lead aspects of worship. This level was tied to the element of fire, to courage, to the sun. One was no longer a servant, but a protector of the flame. 5. Perses, the Persian, an acknowledgement of the myth's roots. This level honored the origin of Mithras, as he was said to be born of Persia. The Perses may have embodied both cultural memory and esoteric knowledge. He was a bridge between East and West. 6. Heliodromus, the sun runner, the courier of light. This initiate served Mithras as an emissary of the sun god, Sol. He was said to wield the whip of the sun, to carry fire between worlds. He stood near the pinnacle, a master of the symbolic universe. 7. Potter, the father, the final rank, leader of the Mithraeum. Roar. A red Phrygian cap, a ring, and a staff. A's. Robes were likely ornate, perhaps patterned to resemble the cosmos. The potter had absolute responsibility for the rites, the initiates. In the memory of Mithras, each of these roles served a dual purpose, spiritual ascension and social structure. A Miles might report to a Leo, a Heliodromus might correct the Perses. In this way, the Mithraeum became not just a place of worship, but a society within a society, its own order of ranks, rituals, and responsibilities. But the rituals themselves remain almost entirely lost. No sacred text has survived. No Mithraic gospel, no scrolls or codices outlining beliefs. The only sources we have are inscriptions, graffiti, and the iconography carved into altars and stone reliefs. Yet, across the empire, from Britain to Syria, the same image returns again and again. Mithras slaying the bull, He holds the animal down with supernatural strength, driving his blade into its side. He looks away, serenely, never into the creature's eyes. From the wound springs not death alone, but life. Ears of wheat, a flowing vine, a river of vitality. A dog drinks the blood. A serpent coils. A scorpion pinches the bull's genitals. Above it all, a crescent moon and sun disk, sometimes with faces, watch in silence. To a modern viewer, it's baffling. To the initiate, it was everything. Scholars have suggested the scene represents the cosmic struggle. Mithras is a force of light overcoming animal darkness. Others read it as a metaphor for the cycle of life, sacrifice, and renewal. A few see astrological meaning, the bull as Taurus, Mithras turning the cosmic wheel, presiding over the precession of the equinoxes. We may never know which interpretation is correct, and perhaps that was the point. Mystery religions weren't about doctrine. They were about experience, the awe of the unknown. Mithraism did not offer moral commandments or eternal damnation. It offered ritual, transformation, and most importantly, brotherhood within the Mithraeum. Status from the outside world fell away. A general might sit next to a clerk, patron beside a tax collector. The rituals, initiations, shared meals, symbolic trials bonded them more deeply than the Roman census ever could. They were no longer citizens, betes. They were brothers of the blood. Some evidence suggests that the cult's rituals mimicked the hardships of military life: cold, hunger, darkness, sudden light. Initiates may have been blindfolded, exposed to noise and flame, and even whipped symbolically. The purpose wasn't punishment, but rebirth. Only through discomfort could one shed the self and become something more. Food and drink played a central role. At the heart of each Mithraeum was a stone bench or narrow table where meals were taken together. Archaeological remains, chicken bones, wine, amphorae grains suggest that feasting was sacred. But this wasn't gluttony, it was communion. Not unlike the Christian Eucharist that would rise later. Bread, wine, sharing, but instead of Christ's blood and body, it was the slain bull's bounty, wheat from its tail, wine from its wound. A different kind of sacrifice, a different kind of salvation. Rome tolerated many cults during its pagan era, but Mithraism held a unique place. It didn't threaten the state. It didn't seek political power. It required no temples in the forum, no proclamations, no conversions. It spread from fort to fort, milepost to milepost, with soldiers whispering of the God who lived in caves, who watched from stars, who demanded loyalty, discipline, silence. Even emperors took notice. Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, is said to have been initiated into the Mithraic mysteries. Though his rule was erratic and cruel, his participation hints at the cult's growing prestige. Diocletian, in the late 3rd century, declared Mithras the protector of the empire, erecting altars in his name in places as far-flung as Carnento, modern Austria. But already another faith was rising. Christianity, once persecuted, was spreading fast. It offered something Mithraism did not: community for women and children, public liturgy, care for the poor, and eventually institutional power. As Constantine embraced the cross, the state turned toward the bishops and away from the mysteries. By the 5th century, the Mithraea were closing. Some were quietly abandoned, others were defaced. Christian writers labeled Mithras a demon and the rituals blasphemous. The shared meals became heretical. The bull, once the symbol of sacrifice and renewal, became the emblem of pagan stubbornness. But the stones remained beneath churches, beneath homes, beneath the layers of dust and ash that time lays over all things. In 1937, while workers were restoring the Basilica of San Clemente, they accidentally broke into the lower chamber. What they found astonished them. The stone benches, the faded fresco of the bull, the altar still intact. Centuries of silence have preserved it. Even now, you can visit. Not just in San Clemente, but in London, Ostia, Mainz, Durayo, Mos, Mithria are everywhere, quiet, consistent, forgotten. They speak of a religion that once offered something profound and deeply needed, especially to men whose lives were spent in violence, isolation, or anonymity. And though the rites are silent, the question remains, what were they really seeking? Down there, was it salvation? Meaning, a feeling of control in a chaotic empire? Or was it simply brotherhood, a shared warmth in the cold dark? The story of the Mithraeum, with its smoky chambers and secret rites, is a tale told almost entirely in the absence of women, and that, in itself, is worth pausing over, because in all the recovered Mithraea, from Britain to Syria, in all the inscriptions and offerings, in every careful carving and altar relief, we have not found evidence of a single female initiate. Not one. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a coincidence. It was the architecture of exclusion, set in stone, to be a follower of Mithras. You had to be a man. That meant the Mithraic mysteries were not just religious, but gendered. And for every sacred chamber where a soldier was reborn in the darkness, there was a woman who waited outside, perhaps near the doorway, perhaps at home, or perhaps never knowing at all what went on below. It is here that our story turns toward absence, not what was done, but what was denied. So what was it like to be a woman outside the Mithraeum? Imagine it. It's early 3rd century, a garrison town in the Roman provinces. Your husband is a clerk to the centurion. He spends long evenings away, longer than the hour it takes to balance accounts. See him return with a dusting of ash across his sleeves, the smell of smoke clinging to his tunic. He never says what he's been doing. He tells you it's just a meeting. You don't press. You know that men have things they do without women, but there are whispers in the marketplace. The baker's wife says her husband comes home speaking of stars and bulls in loyalty to an Eastern god she's never heard of. The stable girl, married to a soldier, swears she found a scrap of parchment in his boot, a sketch of a cave, a dagger, and a sunburst. But when she asked about it, he burned it without a word. None of you are allowed to ask questions. None of you are permitted to see. The men who worship Mithras say it is a religion of light, but it is a light they hold tightly inside dark places, away from you. And yet, outside those caves, women were building entire spiritual worlds of their own in Roman religion. Unlike in Mithraism, women could play prominent roles. They could serve as priestesses in the cults of Isis, Cybele, Bonadea, and Vesta. They tended fires, poured libations, led chants in the temples of Isis. Especially, women found not just religious belonging, but emotional sanctuary. The Egyptian goddess was known as a protector of women and children, of childbirth and marriage. Her rites were not hidden in caves, but performed in public temples, often with music, incense, and open processions. And unlike Mithras, Isis was not a figure of conquest, but of care. But even within those cults, there were limits. A woman's spiritual path was often tied to her fertility, her virginity, or her marital status. A Vestal virgin could rise to tremendous prestige, but only if she never married, never bore children, and never so much as looked at a man with desire. If she broke her vow, she was buried alive with a loaf of bread and a candle in a sealed underground chamber in her own Mithraeum of punishment. So we return to the cave. Not the one with torches and lions and feasts of wine, but the symbolic cave where women were placed when they strayed too far from what society allowed. The caves of silence, the caves of exile. In Mithraism, a woman could not even approach the threshold. Her voice was not heard. Her life, however rich, however spiritual, however full of devotion, did not count. It was not inscribed. It was not carved. Okay. She was not allowed to join the journey of the corax to the potter, the raven to the father. Her transformation was unimportant to the mystery, and yet we know she was there, because men do not walk into a cave and become new alone. They bring their burdens with them, their doubts, their lives, and many of those burdens were shaped for better or worse by the women they lived with. The initiate may have sworn a vow of secrecy, but who sewed his tunic for the ritual? Who filled his bag with bread for the long journey to the outpost, where a new Mithraeum was being built? Who tended his wounds after the trial of the Leo, when fire left its mark? She was always there, just never named. Sometimes, if you listen closely to the walls of a Mithraeum, you can feel her absence as loudly as a song in the underground chamber of the Mithraeum at Duriaropos. On the edge of the Syrian desert, the paintings show Mithras with his attendants, Cautes, and Cautopates, a cosmic trio fixed in ritual stillness. The frescoes are bright, faded now, but once filled with reds and blues and golds. No women are depicted. None are honored in inscriptions. And yet, outside the walls of that ancient town, in the dry hills and huts, women were raising children, managing households, praying to gods of their own, carrying small tokens from ivory and bone amulets of protection, fertility, health. Their hands were shaping the empire in silence. They did not need to slay a bull to create life. But what if we imagine for a moment a different Mithraeum, one where the cave opened to all? What would its symbols be? It's not conquest, but connection. It's not secret trials of pain and darkness, but rites of endurance, of unseen labor, of daily resilience. The grades of initiation would not be named for ravens and lions, but for the roles women were forced to inhabit, so often without choice: maiden, wife, widow, mother, midwife, washer, mourner. The sacred feast would not be a reenactment of the bull's death, but a shared table, lentils, barley, honeyed bread, served from hands calloused by decades of grinding grain, washing cloth, lifting infants. The torchlight would not obscure, but illuminate. Not a test of secrecy, but a ceremony of witness. A sacred space where the women outside the real Mithraeum could finally enter and be seen. But of course, that temple was never built. And so the real women, the ones whose names we do not know, lived and died with their stories hidden behind a stone. And even now, when we excavate these underground chambers, when we read aloud the ranks of Corax and Leo and Potter, we rarely pause to ask what was lost by keeping women away. What wisdom never entered the circle? What knowledge remained forever outside the flame? The irony is quiet, but sharp. A religion devoted to light kept half of humanity in the dark. And so, the Mithraeum remains a metaphor, not just for Roman mystery cults, but for the many places in history where women were not only excluded, but erased. Yet, keep finding evidence of them in the coins, buried beneath thresholds, in the bone needles wedged between stones, in the scribbled names on amphorae, once thought to be meaningless. They were not meaningless. They were lives. They were names. They were women outside the temple, and they deserve to be remembered. Before the chimes of Mass echoed through St. Peter's Basilica, before the Vatican's long marbled hallways held the whispers of popes, bishops, and saints, there was something else. There was silence, but it was not the silence of prayer. It was the silence of the dead. A quiet city beneath a hill, tucked beside the old Roman circus, where stone slabs and painted tombs spoke of bakers and freedmen, daughters and fathers, humble lives drawn to rest in the shadow of imperial power. The Vatican Hill, Mons Vaticanus, was not always a sacred precinct. Long before it held the world's most powerful church, it was a burial ground, necropolis, a city of the dead. And here, in the calm shade of cypress trees and quiet columbaria, the earliest layers of Rome's past lay patiently waiting, sealed beneath centuries of faith, It's strange to think of the Vatican, that bastion of divine authority, white and golden and soaring with splendor, resting on what is essentially a giant cemetery. But it is, and that cemetery is older than the church itself. To understand what was buried beneath the Vatican before Christianity took root, we must travel back to a Rome before saints, before popes, before even Jesus had been born. The first burials on the western slope of the Vatican Hill date to the 1st century BCE. By then, Roman law had long forbidden burials within the city walls. Death was something to be kept outside the boundaries of civic life, a necessary conclusion to it, but not a welcome participant in its daily rhythms. So tombs were built beyond the pomerium, the sacred urban line, the Vatican slope, lying just beyond the Tiber and outside the old city, made for a suitable resting place. And in the centuries that followed, this slope became densely packed with family tombs, elaborate mausolea, and humble graves. The living brought flowers, oil lamps, and coins for the dead, and the dead in stone epitaphs whispered their stories to those who would visit. Most of the names carved into the tombs were not emperors or senators. They were commoners. Freed slaves, soldiers, bakers, masons, couriers, entire families of workers and their descendants. They built Rome's streets, managed its kitchens, repaired its roofs. They were not famous, but they were real. And when they died, they were placed with care into this gentle rise of land by the early 1st century CE. The Vatican slope was filled with neatly arranged mausoleums along a well-trodden road, a narrow via lined with tombs, niches, and urns, some painted with vibrant frescoes of birds, gardens, and mythic scenes. Others bore Latin inscriptions. Here lies Tiberius Claudius Onesimus, freedman of Claudius, baker by trade. Or, to my sweet daughter Flavia, who died too soon. May the earth rest lightly on you. These tombs tell us more than history books ever could. They show us love, grief, social status, and quiet acts of remembrance. And while many of these dead were pagans, not Christians, I buried their kin with deep ritual care, incense, garlands, offerings. The necropolis was not forgotten ground. It was visited, decorated, and alive with memory. It is here, among these early tombs, that we begin to see something curious. A shift in tone around the mid-2nd century. A few of the tombs begin to change. The inscriptions grow simpler. The symbols shift. No longer just mythic figures or birds, but anchors, fish, and loaves of bread. These are Christian symbols, very early ones. It would be another century before Christianity became legal. But already, quietly, Rome's dead were changing. These early Christians weren't buried in catacombs just yet. That would come later. For now, many were laid to rest in the same necropolis as their pagan neighbors, but with subtle marks of their new faith. A chiro carved beside a name, a shepherd carrying a lamb, or a phrase etched into stone, in peace. In peace, peace was something they didn't always have in life. Early Christians were a suspect group, not because they worshipped Jesus, but because they refused to honor the Roman gods. That made them socially dangerous, subversive, but they died as everyone does, and they were buried, as others were, in the earth. And among these Christian graves, one tomb stood apart. It was a modest grave, tucked against an older wall, built into a niche. Nothing spectacular, but in time it became known, and later claimed as the resting place of Peter. Yes, that Peter, the fisherman from Galilee, the follower of Christ. The one who, according to Christian tradition, was crucified in Rome under the reign of Nero by the 4th century Emperor Constantine. Rome's first Christian emperor chose this very spot to construct a basilica, not in the Forum, not in the heart of the imperial city, but on the Vatican Hill, outside the walls, directly over what he believed was the tomb of St. Peter. This decision was not random. It was strategic, a move of sacred urban planning. The church over the apostles' bones, and you claim both spiritual legitimacy and physical presence. But to do so, Constantine had to bury the necropolis, and so the construction began. Massive retaining walls were built. The slope was reshaped. The mausolea of hundreds, perhaps thousands of Romans were covered in soil and concrete. Their names were erased from the surface, not from malice, but from the need to elevate a new foundation. The Basilica of St. Peter was not built on clean ground. It was built on the backs of forgotten dead, and then it rose by 360 CE. The Constantinian Basilica stood in full splendor, columns, mosaics, relics, the massive canopy marking Peter's alleged tomb. But below that canopy, sealed in shadow and stone, the necropolis still slept, and it slept for centuries now. One saw it again until the 20th century. It wasn't until the 1940s, during excavations ordered by Pope Pius XII, that the necropolis was uncovered. Bit by bit, archaeologists peeled back the layers. Beneath the basilica's crypt, they found walls, tiles, urns, inscriptions that hadn't seen light in over 1,500 years. They found the lost city of the Vatican Hill, and there, in the center of it all, they found a tomb. Not a grand one, not imperial, but central, revered, with graffiti scrawled on the surrounding walls. Primitive, heartfelt inscriptions. Petrosini, Peter is here. Is it really Peter's tomb? Scholars debate that still. The bones found nearby were of a man in his 60s, buried in a niche within a marble-lined repository. No skull, no feet, just fragments. Were these moved there later? Were they truly Peter's, or just honored as such? We may never know, but the grave, whoever it belonged to, had become sacred by the 4th century, and its presence shaped the entire history of the Vatican. Today, pilgrims walk above that quiet necropolis, never seeing it. They step over mausolea, belonging to freed slaves and soldiers. They kneel above tombs that once held bakers, daughters, scribes. Most will never know their names, but for a moment, you do. You know that beneath the grandeur, beneath the golden altars and Latin hymns, there lies a city of the dead, ordinary Romans, forgotten lives, and perhaps that's the strangest irony of all, that the greatest church in Christendom, a place of resurrection and eternity, is built upon a place of burial, silence, and memory. We ask much of the dead. We bury them, we forget them, and sometimes we build entire empires above them. But if you listen carefully, beneath the marble floors and whispered prayers, you can still hear them, not in words, but in stones, in soil, and stories, unfinished. Waiting, waiting beneath the altar of saints, beneath the shadow of Peter, beneath the Vatican. What else lies, buried, unmarked, unseen? And if we unearthed every tomb beneath every cathedral, how many forgotten lives would we find? How many did we leave behind? We return now to the ground beneath the Vatican, the world that once lived, died, and was then forgotten. The world not of marble saints, but of crumbling bricks, soot-darkened frescoes, clay lamps left as offerings by grieving hands. When the first archaeologists entered the Vatican necropolis in the 1940s, it did so through a corridor beneath the papal grottos. At first, it was believed they'd find only a few early Christian graves, perhaps a fragment of history, to support the church's ancient claims. But what they found was something altogether older, stranger, richer, a vast, remarkably preserved Roman burial site, stretching out beneath the modern basilica like the forgotten bones of another Rome, entirely row upon row of family mausolea. Bright colors, still vibrant after 15 centuries. Marble inscriptions, carefully lettered by hands, long turned to dust. Some tombs were grand, decorated with columns and intricate floor mosaics. Others were smaller, their walls covered in frescoes of birds, vines, and banquet scenes. All were arranged along a narrow, paved road, as though the dead still waited for visitors to pass by and offer a word, a flower, a coin to walk through. This necropolis is to enter a hidden Rome, not the Rome of emperors, but of people, real people, ones who lived ordinary lives. In one tomb, an inscription commemorates a woman named Claudia Prima, buried by her son. Her likeness is painted on the wall, hair curled in the Roman fashion, a hint of a smile, eyes fixed forever on the entrance. She was someone's mother, someone's memory. In another tomb, built for a Roman baker named Marcus Virgilius Eurysaces, carvings of bread ovens and kneading troughs decorate the space. The message is clear. This man was proud of his work. He fed the city. And now his story is baked into stone. The Vatican necropolis is full of such stories. A young girl, no older than 10, laid to rest with her favorite toy, a small doll carved from ivory, a freed slave, buried beside the master who later married her, a family of 3 generations, each tomb layer telling a different chapter of the same long, quiet story. And beneath all of this, something even more sacred, in the heart of the necropolis stands a structure known as the Trophy of Gaius. It is small, modest, built from brick and plaster, not gold or marble, but it has been the center of centuries of speculation. Name comes from a 2nd century Christian writer, Gaius of Rome, who wrote to a rival theologian, "I can point to the trophies of the apostles. If you go to the Vatican or to the Ostian Way, you will find the trophies of Peter and of Paul." He wasn't referring to statues or relics. He meant physical memorials, shrines. And here, in the Vatican necropolis, archaeologists found exactly that: a wall of brickwork, older than Constantine's basilica, built against the red wall of an earlier Roman structure. In front of it stood a simple altar. The area was clearly revered, evidence of graffiti scratched by pilgrims into the plaster, with messages like, "Petros Ini," "Peter is here, pray for us, Peter." For centuries, the church believed this was the original site of Peter's grave, marked and venerated long before Christianity became legal. But things weren't so simple. The bones found in this area were not in a tomb, but in a small, marble-lined repository hidden behind the wall itself. There was no inscription, no label, just bones, who they belonged to, and when they were placed there remains one of the great mysteries of the Vatican. The man who led the investigation, Monsignor Ludwig Kaas, was both meticulous and cautious. He kept the findings quiet, aware of the religious and political implications. Decades later, under Pope Paul VI, the Vatican publicly stated that the bones were identified in a manner which we can hold to be convincing as those of St. Peter. But scientific certainty is harder to pin down. The bones were examined. They belonged to a man in his 60s, broad-built, buried with care, but they were found without the feet, which, according to Christian tradition, supports the belief that Peter was crucified upside down, and his feet were removed to release the body from the cross. Still, no name was attached, no DNA, no unbroken chain of custody, only belief, only story, only faith, and perhaps, in this place, that's enough. But what makes the Vatican necropolis so haunting isn't just the possible presence of Peter's remains. It's the quiet lives. All around him, the mosaic of forgotten names, buried in shadow while a single tomb rose to power. When Constantine built the first basilica in the 4th century, his engineers faced a challenge. The Vatican Hill was steep and uneven. The necropolis was not a clean, flat site. To build a church, they would need to level the ground, and in doing so, we buried over 2/3 of the necropolis in soil and stone. Only a narrow corridor, just a slice of the ancient street, remained accessible for centuries. It wasn't until modern excavations began in the mid-20th century that the full extent of what lay beneath was rediscovered. Imagine the surprise of the workers. digging beneath the crypts of popes, only to uncover painted walls from the 2nd century, or an inscription to a Roman courier named Titus, who died on duty. Every discovery was a reminder. The Vatican was not built from nothing. It grew from layers of memory, of death, of longing, and even now, beneath the towering dome of Michelangelo, beneath the marble saints and the echoes of organ music, that older world remains, preserved in shadow, sealed in silence. By now, you have walked the narrow streets of the ancient Vatican necropolis, not the Vatican of white marble, but the one of clay bricks and smoky incense, where the dead were honored with whispers and oil lamps. The third section of this story is less about discovery, and more about what happened next, because while the early archaeologists uncovered stunning mosaics, elaborate tombs, and possibly even the bones of Peter himself, something else emerged quietly in the background, a question no one could answer directly. What does it mean to bury one civilization beneath another? And who, in that long silence, gets remembered? Let us begin, once again, with the bones. After the discovery of the brick wall and shrine, what came to be known as the Trophy of Gaius, the attention of the Vatican turned to the marble box found in a niche behind it. It contained bones, not in a sealed sarcophagus, not in an ornate reliquary, but placed with care into a box that, it seemed, had been deliberately hidden behind the wall, perhaps to protect it when Constantine's builders leveled the necropolis to construct the basilica above. These bones were analyzed. K belonged to a robust male, aged between 60 and 70. The feet were missing. The remains had been wrapped in a purple cloth threaded with gold, the kind of fabric reserved for high honor or imperial use in late antiquity. But the bones were mixed with dirt from the area of the shrine, soil that had filtered in naturally. No inscription, no tag, no direct proof. It was not scientific certainty that tied the bones to St. Peter. It was an echo of tradition, layered over centuries, late on letters, legends, and later confirmations from the church. Still, there was a symbolic power in the possibility, because the church had not always been an empire of stone and gold. It had begun here, in catacombs, homes, and open-air gatherings, beneath Roman suspicion, in shadows. To think that the bones of its most prominent apostle may have survived not only execution, but centuries of upheaval and rebuilding, was a powerful idea. So, in 1968, Pope Paul VI announced to the world that the remains found behind the red wall were identified in a manner which we can hold to be convincing as belonging to St. Peter. The box of bones was returned to its place, still behind the red wall, near the trophy, buried deep beneath the altar of the modern basilica. It was no longer simply archaeology. It was sacred ground. And yet, all around that venerated spot, the other tombs remained half forgotten, often overlooked, yet no less real. Let's return to one, the tomb of the Valeri, built by a family of freedmen in the early 2nd century CE. This mausoleum is one of the most ornate in the necropolis. Its walls are decorated with frescoes of winged spirits and pastoral scenes, not overtly Christian, but full of symbolic longing. Inside the tomb, archaeologists found the bones of men and women, fathers, sons, daughters, along with carefully arranged burial goods. One man was buried with his writing stylus, another with a small bronze key, perhaps for a chest of memories or a household altar. They are not named in Scripture. No theologians wrote letters to them, but they were once as alive as Peter, as Constantine, as the pilgrims who later knelt above them without ever knowing they were there. Their quiet stories raise a strange, unsettling question. How many of the earliest Christians, the ones who kept the faith alive during Rome's persecutions, were buried here, now completely anonymous? Some tombs bear the Chiro symbol, the first two Greek letters of Christ's name etched discreetly in the plaster. Others contain imagery that bridges two worlds, pagan banquet scenes next to Christian doves, suggesting a slow, evolving transition from old rites to new. It wasn't a moment, after all. It was a process, a long blending of memory and belief, stone and story. By the 4th century, when Constantine ordered the construction of the first St. Peter's Basilica, the necropolis had already been used for over 2 centuries to build the church. His engineers did something bold. They leveled the hill. They filled in the burial chambers. They cut into the necropolis, slicing through tombs, sealing others entirely beneath earth and marble. The goal was clear. The church must be above Peter's grave. All else was sacrificed to that vision. In one way, it was an act of reverence. In another, it was an erasure, because entire families, Roman, Christian, unknown, were sealed beneath the floor, turned to anonymous foundations for the empire of the church. When you walk through the scavi, the necropolis tours beneath St. Peter's today, you pass half-tombs, roofs crushed by centuries of weight, and passageways darkened not just by time, but by the quiet disappearance of so many names. It is peaceful. It is haunting. The air is thick, not just with history, but with the feeling that this place remembers things the surface does not. That for every name carved into a PayPal tomb above, there, 10, 50, 100 more below, voices without monuments, faces without relics. What, then, do we remember? What was buried beneath the Vatican before the church existed? Not just Peter, but Rome's forgotten dead, the children of bakers and scribes, the wives of Freedmen, the laborers who paved the roads, the early Christians who scratched prayers into soft plaster and prayed for the return of spring. They are all part of the foundation, literally and symbolically, and it is perhaps fitting that the church, now so concerned with legacy and canon, was built on a place where the forgotten outnumbered the remembered, where graves face west instead of east, where Greek and Latin names lie side by side, where some tombs speak in Christian code and others in pagan poetry. It is not a contradiction. It is a reminder. History is not built from certainty, but from layers, and beneath every cathedral, there is a quiet city, a city of the dead, a city of memory, one that speaks softly, if you are willing to listen. And so, sword from the underground passages, back into the sunlit aisles of St. Peter's, or out into the piazza, where Bernini's colonnade embraces the crowds, you might feel a different kind of awe, not just for what is here, but for what still lies just beneath your feet, waiting, unfinished, remembered only by the earth itself. Before the Vatican was a sanctuary of saints, for it echoed with Latin liturgies and incense, and long before Peter's bones were honored by pilgrims, it was something else entirely. It was a garden, a private estate, a piece of real estate, on the fringe of ancient Rome, chosen not for its holiness, but for its peace. To understand what was once buried here, one must first understand the woman who once owned it, Julia Agrippina, better known to history as Agrippina the Elder. She was not just anyone. Capina was the granddaughter of Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Her bloodline coursed with political ambition, divine association, and personal tragedy. She may have been the first noble Roman to claim ownership of the Vatican Hill, not as a holy site, but as a pleasure garden. Let's go back to the early 1st century CE. Rome was still tightening its grip on the known world. The Tiber flowed thick and slow through the heart of the empire, and on its western bank, across from the bustling heart of the city, lay a quieter area, flat, fertile land, just outside the formal walls. It was rural compared to the Palatine, or Esquiline hills, and it carried no particular religious weight. But it offered something valuable to Rome's elite. Space, tight, space to breathe, space to cultivate, space to build villas, summer homes, and expansive landscaped gardens away from the soot and noise of the city center. This was where Agrippina, widow of the brilliant but ill-fated General Germanicus, settled with her children after her husband's death. Among those children was the boy who would become Emperor Caligula, and later, through his line, Nero. The Vatican Hill was not yet holy. It was aristocratic, Agrippina's estate. Known in antiquity as the hoary Agrippinae Gardens of Agrippina, was one of many luxurious properties that dotted the right bank of the Tiber. These gardens were not mere flower beds. Roman gardens, or horti, were expansive combinations of orchards, dining pavilions, statuary, fountains, covered walkways, and porticos designed for leisure, philosophy, and display of wealth. They were the Roman answer to anxiety, a place where senators could retreat and pretend, if only for an afternoon, that they were above politics. The horti of Agrippina were likely planted with cypresses, myrtles, and box hedges. They may have had grottos, mosaicked bathhouses, and artificial pools. These were common features among Roman elites who wished to model their estates after the palatial grounds of Alexandria or Athens. Statues of gods, busts of ancestors, and imported marbles would have lined the colonnades, and all of this every shaded pergola and perfumed street existed precisely where St. Peter's Basilica stands today. It is a strange twist of history, because Agrippina, as noble as she was, had no idea her gardens would one day be buried beneath the cornerstone of Western Christianity. For her, this land was not sacred. It was strategic, it was beautiful, and it was safe. For a time, her life, like so many lives in the Julio-Claudian dynasty, ended not in peace, but in persecution. After the death of Germanicus, Agrippina fell into conflict with the Emperor Tiberius. She accused him of poisoning her husband. He saw her ambition and perhaps her popularity as a threat. In 29 CE, she was exiled to the island of Pandateria, and a few years later, she died, likely by starvation, either imposed or voluntary. Her son, Caligula, who spent part of his youth on the estate, would become emperor after Tiberius. And here the story of the Vatican takes a peculiar turn, because it was Caligula, infamous for his eccentricities and cruelty, who left one of the most peculiar literal marks on the Vatican Hill, a racetrack, not for horses or for chariots. Caligula was fascinated by spectacle, and under his rule, the grounds of the horti Agrippinae expanded to include a circus, an elongated oval racetrack, similar to the Circus Maximus, but smaller. This structure came to be known as the Circus of Gaius and Nero, a misnomer because it was Caligula who built it, but his nephew, Nero, later renovated it. The circus stretched across what is now the southern portion of the Vatican, roughly aligned with the Basilica's transept. It was oriented east-west and could seat thousands. It had a central spina, turning posts, and rows of seats. Unlike the solemn architecture of later Christian churches, this place rang with the screams of crowds and the thunder of hooves, and, more than that, it would one day become a site of execution. It was here, according to early Christian tradition, that Peter was crucified, not in a quiet garden, but in a loud public arena, used for sport and spectacle. It is another strange irony that Agrippina's leisure estate, built for peace, would become a place of blood. But for now, in the mid-1st century CE, the circus was merely a marvel, a sign of imperial presence, a place to stage games, entertain the masses, and distract the senators. When Nero inherited the estate, he did more than renovate the circus. He expanded the use of the hill. In 64 CE, after the Great Fire of Rome, Nero faced increasing public scrutiny. The fire had destroyed much of the city, and many blamed Nero for either starting it or doing little to stop it. In response, he sought scapegoats. The growing sect of Christians, still obscure and mistrusted, became the targets. Tacitus, The Roman historian tells us that Nero punished them with savage cruelty. Some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were burned alive to light his gardens at night. Some were, according to later traditions, crucified in the circus of Nero. This was not yet persecution on a grand, empire-wide scale that would come later, but it was the first recorded, state-sponsored brutality against Christians, and it happened here, on the land once planted with roses and lined with mosaic fountains, Agrippina's gardens, Caligula's circus, Nero's executions, all layered upon each other like sediment in the Roman soil. By the end of the 1st century, the Vatican Hill was no longer just a retreat. It was haunted, not literally, but symbolically, by memory, by bones, by suffering. Still, it remained outside the city walls. It was a marginal space, not yet sacred, but no longer simply aristocratic. And it was in that in-between space, not quite holy, not quite forgotten, that the idea of a pilgrimage site began to take root. People remembered that Peter, the apostle, had died there, that he had been buried there, that something had happened on that hill, something strange and powerful. Even if it wasn't yet called Christianity, in time, the gardens of Agrippina would vanish from maps, the circus would fall into ruin, but their presence would linger, hidden beneath centuries of construction, buried beneath marble, shadowed beneath faith. And perhaps that's the strangest thing of all, that long before the saints and relics, before the popes and pilgrims, the Vatican Hill belonged to a woman of power, a mother, a widow, a victim of exile, lover of gardens. Agrippina never saw what would come of her estate, but if she could, perhaps she would have smiled, not at the grandeur, but at the quiet irony that the hill she once walked in sandals would become the most sacred place on earth for a religion still persecuted in her lifetime. When you stand today in the center of St. Peter's Square, the ground beneath your feet seems still. Marble tiles, smoothed by centuries of pilgrims, gentle fountains, the low murmur of water, pigeons that flutter lazily around the colonnades. Tourists take photos, clergy pass quietly. The air feels reverent, but beneath that calm, beneath that symmetry, beneath the obedient geometry of Bernini's colonnade, there lies a chaos of history. A mess of broken columns, shattered amphorae, reused bricks, and stones carved with pagan names, buried and forgotten for almost 2,000 years, are the bones of an ancient racetrack. A circus built not for prayer, but for spectacle, and the dead who once fed the crowds, their agony. The circus of Nero, sometimes called the Circus of Caligula, began as an imperial indulgence. As told in the previous section, it was constructed as an arena for chariot races and mock battles. It's commissioned by Emperor Caligula on the grounds of the Horti Agrippini, lavish private estate belonging to his mother. But it was Nero who would give the structure its name and its infamy. Let us imagine the scene. The year is 65. Rome is a city, still licking its wounds from the great fire of the previous year. 2/3 of the city have been destroyed. Its temples, tenements, and public baths have burned. Nero's political reputation is smoldering too. Rumors swirl that he started the fire himself, perhaps to clear land for his grand domus aurea, the Golden House. The people grumble. The Senate eyes him with suspicion. Nero, ever theatrical, needs a diversion, and so he turns to blood. He revives games at the circus, but not the traditional kind. No mere chariot races or gladiatorial contests. He needs a new kind of spectacle, one that will satisfy public outrage and remind Rome who rules it. He needs a scapegoat. Enter the Christians, still an obscure sect at this point. The early Christians are misunderstood and mistrusted by the Roman populace. Their rituals are held in secret. They refuse to worship the emperor. They speak of resurrection and eternal life, of strange banquets and loyalty to a foreign king. Their beliefs seem not just foreign, but subversive. Tacitus, the Roman historian, tells us in grim detail what came next. Nero blamed the Christians for the fire. He rounded them up, not for trial, but for entertainment. Some were dressed in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were nailed to crosses. Some were covered in pitch and set alight, human torches used to illuminate Nero's evening garden parties. And some, perhaps most famously, were brought to the circus. Imagine the arena. It is wide, long, flanked on either side by curved stone seating. A spina, the long central barrier, runs down the center. Obelisks and statues line its length. Chariots would have once sped around its curves, but on this day, the chariots are still in their place. Crosses, one of them, tradition says, bears the body of a fisherman from Galilee, Peter, Simon Peter, once a disciple of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, an old man in Rome. Tradition holds that he had been ministering quietly, preaching to the small Christian community in the city. He had survived persecution before. He had fled prisons. He had escaped Herod's chains, but not this time. He was captured, likely as part of Nero's crackdown, and he was sentenced to death, like his teacher before him. He was to be crucified. But Peter, according to later writings, like the Acts of Peter, requested a strange favor to be crucified upside down, not because he feared death, but because he felt unworthy to die in the same manner as Christ. Whether that detail is literal or poetic, we may never know. What we do know is that sometime around 64 or 65 CE, Peter was killed in Rome, likely in the circus of Nero. His body, according to early Christian accounts, was taken by followers, perhaps by a woman named Marcellina, or a Christian community that had hidden nearby and settled, quietly buried in a humble grave on the Vatican Hill, a non-consecrated pagan hill. An acropolis, it is strange to consider. Peter, the rock upon which Jesus declared he would build his church, was buried not in a place of reverence, but in a public cemetery, amid tombs of Roman artisans and freedmen. A place no one thought sacred, a place no Roman noble would be caught dead, though many were buried there nonetheless. Over the centuries, exact location of Peter's grave faded into memory. Persecutions would come and go. Christians would be hunted, exiled, burned, and blamed for everything from plagues to famine. But gradually, almost invisibly, Peter's grave became a shrine. Pilgrims came. They lit candles. They scratched graffiti into the tombs near his. "Peter, pray for us," some wrote. And above his grave, century after century, something was built, not all at once, not like now. First, a modest memorial, then a small shrine by the time of Constantine, the first Christian emperor. Thing monumental was underway. Around 324 CE, Constantine ordered the construction of a basilica over what was believed to be the grave of St. Peter. But the Vatican Hill posed a challenge. It was not flat, it was filled with tombs. Necropolis stretched along its slope, pagan graves, Jewish mausolea, and perhaps Christian ones. 2.2 Build the church. Constantine ordered much of it to be leveled. Earth was moved. Graves were displaced. Marble columns were laid down, and over the spot where Peter's remains were said to rest, an altar was placed. That altar became the focal point of what would become St. Peter's Basilica. And beneath that altar, for over 1,000 years, Peter's bones were believed to lie, forgotten but not lost, hidden but not erased. It wasn't until the 20th century, during renovations under Pope Pius XII, that excavations beneath the basilica revealed the ancient necropolis, tombs carved with Latin inscriptions, mosaics of Orpheus and Dionysus, graffiti walls marked with Christian prayers, and a modest burial spot with bones, not a full skeleton, But enough to stir faith, enough to stir questions. Could these be Peter's bones? In 1968, after years of study, Paul VI declared that the remains found beneath the altar were indeed those of Peter. Whether one believes in the accuracy of that identification or not, symbolism is powerful. The Basilica of St. Peter, the heart of the Catholic world, stands not just on a foundation of faith, but literally above a graveyard, above the gardens of Agrippina, above the circus of Nero, above centuries of suffering, decay, and buried history. And perhaps that's what makes it so strange. The Vatican is often thought of as timeless, as eternal, but it was not born sacred. It was made sacred by memory, by blood, by soil, and by the long, slow burial of every previous identity it once had. Agrippina's leisure retreat, Caligula's circus, Nero's execution ground, a forgotten tomb, a whisper of a martyr, a pile of dirt, a shrine, a church, a kingdom, a mystery, a mystery. As the centuries passed, the Roman Empire cracked and collapsed. Armies rose and fell. Borders shrank. The marble statues of the emperors were toppled or repurposed, their names forgotten, their monuments crumbling in the slow moisture of time. And while the great cities of the empire turned to shadow and silence, the small hill across the Tiber, the Vatican Hill, quietly began to assume a new form of power. But that power did not come all at once. It began with footfalls. Pilgrims from all corners of the crumbling empire, North Africa, Hispania, Gaul, Cappadocia, came walking for weeks, even months, to see the simple altar built over the grave of a man they believed had stood face to face with Christ. They didn't come for opulence. They came for memory, and perhaps for reassurance that something eternal still lingered amid the decay. By the 4th century, Constantine's basilica had taken shape, but it wasn't like the basilica that stands today. That one. The soaring Renaissance cathedral wouldn't arrive for more than 1,000 years. Constantine's basilica was simpler, a wide rectangular building with 5 naves and a timber roof. It looked out onto the circus of Nero, the very place where Peter had died. The obelisk that had once stood at the center of the spina, the circus central barrier, still stood tall. That same obelisk stands today in the center of St. Peter's Square, but it did not always. For centuries after Constantine, the Vatican declined again. Rome itself, now without emperors or armies, shrank to a provincial shell. Vandals invaded in 455, then the Ostrogoths, then the Lombards. The city's population fell to a trickle. Many of the old imperial buildings became farms. Grain was grown in the forum. Donkeys walked among fallen marble columns. The aqueducts dried up, but the grave of Peter and the church above it remained. It became a symbol, not just of religious hope, but of political ambition, and that ambition began to grow. In the centuries that followed, the popes, now the bishops of Rome, began to claim more than just spiritual authority. They claimed inheritance from Peter, from the empire, from heaven itself. One document, now widely accepted as a forgery, accelerated this transformation. The donation of Constantine, supposedly written by Constantine himself. The document claimed that the first Christian emperor had granted the Pope dominion over Rome and the western half of the empire. It was likely written in the 8th century, but its influence was enormous. Popes began to act not just as pastors, but as princes. They levied taxes, minted coins, commanded armies, and built. The old Constantinian basilica began to seem too modest by the time of the Renaissance. Popes like Julius II envisioned something grander, something that would outshine every cathedral in Christendom. Anew. St. Peter's. But there was a problem. To build the new basilica, the old one had to be destroyed, and that meant disturbing the very ground and the very tomb that had once been the church's foundation. It was a delicate operation. spiritual risk, and a historical gamble. Julius II began the project in 1506. He commissioned Donato Bramante to design the new basilica. Bramante's plans were bold, a Greek cross layout with a massive dome. But he died before the work could be completed. The project passed through many hands: Raphael, Sangalo, and ultimately Michelangelo. The church we know today, St. Peter's Basilica, was not completed until 1606. It took 120 years to build, stone by stone. The old church was dismantled, and beneath it, the builders found reminders of the past, not just Peter's shrine, but fragments of older graves, Roman tombs, traces of the circus, and countless reused bricks bearing pagan symbols and Latin names. They built anyway. They had to. The new church was not just a place of worship. It was a monument of supremacy. It was the architectural embodiment of papal authority: soaring marble, vast arches, and a dome that towered above all of Rome. It was meant to last until the end of time. But, as with all things buried and rebuilt, the layers did not disappear. They lingered, silently. The Vatican Hill had become a palimpsest, a manuscript written, scraped away, and written over again. Its soil contained the dust of a Roman garden. Its stone held the cracks of Nero's circus. Its foundation rested on a fisherman's grave. And as pilgrims came to see the wonders of the Renaissance, few realized what lay just meters beneath their feet. That silence would continue until the 20th century, during World War II. As the world was again breaking apart, Pope Pius XII quietly authorized a team of excavators to explore beneath the basilica. Their mission was to find Peter. It was not announced publicly. The Vatican did not want scandal. But what they found was astonishing. Beneath the high altar of St. Peter's Basilica, they uncovered a complex necropolis, a street of Roman mausoleums, built for merchants, freedmen, artisans, and their families. Each tomb was decorated. Some had painted walls, others mosaics. Some had inscriptions that blended pagan and Christian imagery. There were winged spirits, wine cups, and doves. There were Greek letters and Latin prayers, and there was a small area, modest, almost unremarkable, with graffiti scratched in a crude hand: Petros Eni, Peter is here. Near that wall, they found bones. They were analyzed. They belonged to an elderly man, robust, likely in his 60s or 70s. No skull, and missing parts of the feet. Some believe this matches the tradition of Peter's crucifixion, upside down. That his body was removed from the cross by severing the legs. The bones were buried in a niche behind a marble shrine. Whether they are truly Peter's is still debated. But in 1968, Pope Paul VI declared, "We believe we have found the mortal remains of the Prince of the Apostles, and those bones now rest in a plexiglass case beneath the altar." Pilgrims still come, but few know what they are standing above. They do not see the forgotten graves, the ruined circus, the gardens of Agrippina, the leisure palace of Caligula, the slaughter ground of Nero, the pagan mausoleums carved with poetry and grief, the Roman mothers who buried their children beneath this earth. Centuries before Peter's bones arrived, it is all still there, still buried, still waiting. And perhaps that is the final strangeness of the Vatican Hill. It is a place that was never meant to matter. A fringe of the city, a garden, a racetrack, a necropolis. A quiet hill no one paid attention to until the day a man was crucified there. A man with no money, no sword, no rank, just a name: Peter, the Rock. And on that rock, buried in blood, bone, and time, an empire was built. It is easy to walk past it and never wonder. Thousands do, every day. Tourists cross St. Peter's Square. Heads tilted back at the colonnades or the dome, perhaps glancing at the fountains or the guards in striped Renaissance uniforms. And in the center, standing quietly, between the twin fountains like a long-forgotten sentinel. It's an obelisk. It casts a shadow across the cobbles, long, dark, and unnoticed, but that stone has seen more history than any cathedral. Before the basilica, before Christianity, before Peter or Nero, or even the idea of Rome as an empire, that obelisk came from another world entirely, from the Nile, from the red desert wind of Heliopolis, from the forgotten gods of ancient Egypt. Its story begins almost 2,000 years before St. Peter's Square was ever paved. In the city of Heliopolis, city of the sun, Pharaoh Menkares, or possibly one of his successors during the 5th dynasty, ordered the creation of a red granite obelisk to honor Ra, Tia, the sun god. It was to be one of many, Tia, towering. Four-sided columns were not simply decorative. They were sacred, embodying the petrified rays of the sun. They symbolized the eternal power of divine light and divine kingship. Each was carved from a single piece of stone, quarried near Aswan, then hauled hundreds of miles northward along the Nile. They stood before temples that, not inside, they belonged to the sky. They were meant to point upward, unbroken, eternal. No one knows the exact name of the obelisk, now standing in Vatican Square. Egyptian records are silent on this one. But sometime during the early imperial period of Rome, this particular obelisk was taken, plucked from its desert sanctuary, and shipped across the sea. The Romans were obsessed with Egyptian monuments, not out of respect, but domination. To take an obelisk and erect it in your capital was a declaration of supremacy. That even the gods of other civilizations could be rearranged beneath the will of Rome. This one was brought by Caligula. Sometime around 37 to 41 CE, it arrived in Rome during a time of imperial vanity and cruelty, when the young emperor was spending vast fortunes on public spectacles, gilded ships, and marble excess. He had a plan for the Vatican Hill, still mostly a quiet rural area across the Tiber. A new circus was to be built there, a racetrack larger than most homes, where chariot wheels would fly and blood would fall on sand. And at the center of it, on the spina, the dividing barrier, he placed the obelisk. It became the axis of the circus. Racers would loop around it. Spectators would cheer beside it, and beneath its shadow. Centuries later, Peter would be executed. When Peter was crucified upside down, as tradition holds, it was likely within sight of this stone. The obelisk saw it all. It was there when Nero turned the circus into a house of horrors. Blaming Christians for the Great Fire of 64 CE, men and women were tied to posts and set alight. Others were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Some were crucified. Peter, by his request, not in imitation of his Lord, but in humility, upside down. The obelisk stood silent. It saw emperors pass. It saw the city change. It saw Constantine come and build the first basilica just a short walk away. But it remained where Caligula had placed it for over 1,500 years. It stood on the spina of a circus that slowly turned to ruin. The chariots stopped. The crowds vanished. The seats fell apart. But the obelisk endured long after the structures around it crumbled into soil. Pilgrims to the early basilica knew it was there. They walked past it, called it pagan, cursed its past, but it remained untouched until 1586. That year, a different kind of spectacle unfolded. The new basilica, the Renaissance jewel that still defines the skyline, was nearly finished, but the piazza before it remained empty, undefined. Pope Sixtus V, a hard-edged reformer with little patience for idolatry or inefficiency, wanted the square crowned with the symbol of Christian victory. He chose the obelisk, but not to destroy it, to move it, to cleanse it of its pagan identity and make it serve the church. This was no small task. The obelisk was over 25 meters tall and weighed more than 320 tons. It had stood in the same spot for almost 1600 years. Moving it across a city square was considered nearly impossible. Engineers warned against it. If it fell, it could shatter. If it tilted, it could crush men. But Sixtus was determined. He commissioned a military engineer, Domenico Fontana, who developed a system involving 900 men, 75 horses, 140 carriages, ropes, winches, and wooden towers. On the morning of April 30th, 1586, the operation began. The entire city watched. Ropes were pulled. Pulleys groaned. Dust filled the air. It took weeks of careful labor, but the obelisk was slowly, inch by inch, lowered from its ancient foundation, moved across the square, and raised again, this time directly in front of St. Peter's Basilica. It had crossed worlds, from Egypt to Rome, from pagan to Christian. Sixtus had a cross placed on top. He inscribed the base with a Latin phrase, "Behold the cross of the Lord. Flee the adversaries. The Lion of the tribe of Judah has conquered." The obelisk was no longer a monument to Ra. It was a trophy of Ith, Christ, or so they believed. But the stone did not change. Its granite was the same. Its surface, weathered by Nile winds, still bore the marks of ancient craftsmen, and within its core still carried the memory of deserts, sun gods, and chariot races. Now it stood in a new silence. Each day, thousands walk past it. Photographers use it to center their shots. Tour guides mention it briefly, but they do not pause to feel what it is. They do not wonder how long it stood there, how many generations it has outlasted, how many regimes it has watched fall, how many screams it has heard. It is older than Christianity, older than Latin, older than Rome itself. It has seen pharaohs die, emperors fall, saints executed, pilgrims weep, armies march, and popes rise. It has seen the Nile and the Tiber, deserts and cathedrals, suns and crosses. It is just a stone, but in that stone is a dia, a bit. It is a dia, but in that stone is a dia, because I'm gonna start out by going to Starbucks. And popes rise. It is seen the Nile and the Stya, and the sand, and the sand, and the sand, and the sand, ascent, and an end. L, well, L, L, I, L, 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 well, L, 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 well, I, L, and I, L, I, S, S, das, as I, Story, not told by voices, not written in books, but lived, endured, etched into every scratch, every crack, every whisper of dust that clings to its weathered base. At noon each day, the shadow it casts marks the hour. But for those who pause, who really pause, it marks something else. The absurdity of time, the fragility of power, and the silence of things that outlast all of us. When a monument is moved, something must always be left behind. In 1586, when Pope Sixtus V ordered the relocation of the ancient Egyptian obelisk from the ruins of Caligula's circus to the center of the new basilica's piazza, the engineers and masons carefully dismantled the foundations that had held the stone in place for over 1,000 years. What they found buried beneath it shocked the man then. Like so many quiet wonders beneath this sacred hill was quickly forgotten. The workers digging beneath the old circus spina didn't just find earth and rubble. They uncovered bones, dozens of them, some charred, some twisted in unnatural ways, and with them came fragments of pottery, broken amphorae, burnt timber, iron nails, bronze clasps, crude etchings of fish, the symbol of a faith that had once lived in the shadows. None of this surprised the Pope. The Vatican Hill had always been considered a place of execution. This was, after all, the site of Nero's circus, a place where the emperor had staged his most terrible shows. Suetonius described the horror of it plainly. Prisoners would be wrapped in animal skins and thrown to starving dogs. Others would be crucified. Still others, accused of arson or treason, were covered in pitch and lit on fire to serve as nighttime illumination. Many of these executions happened in the narrow strip between the two turning posts of the circus, the very spina where the obelisk stood. It was a place of death, and the obelisk had watched. The bones beneath it weren't neatly arranged or reverently buried. They were the remnants of mass slaughter, dumped together in trenches hastily filled. After each show, forgotten bodies, forgotten names, but among the bones, there were also trinkets, a copper ring bearing a tiny cross, a crude pendant with a chiro scratched into its face, palm-sized terracotta tablet with a carved fish, and the Greek letters iota, chi, theta, upsilon, sigma, an acronym early Christians used to identify one another. Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. To the workers, these were oddities. To the papal scholars, they were evidence. This was the sacred ground of martyrdom, even before Constantine, even before basilicas, even before Latin crosses. People had died here for a faith that had no churches, and beneath the very base of that obelisk, buried deeper still, they found something else. A foundation made not of Roman cement, but of repurposed Egyptian stone. It was as if Caligula's builders had not merely placed the obelisk into the earth, but had recreated a little shrine to its origin. Among these blocks, there were inscriptions, not in Latin, in hieroglyphs, faint, weathered, but still decipherable. They spoke not of Christ, or Peter, or Rome, but of Ra, and light, and eternity. One fragment bore a cartouche, the oval ring used to encircle a royal name. Though partial, it likely referred to Menkaure or another early 5th dynasty ruler. Whoever it was, their name had not been spoken in Rome before, and now lay buried beneath the birthplace of Christian power. Pope Sixtus was fascinated. He had the foundation blocks removed and placed into storage, ordering that they be recorded and examined, but within decades they were forgotten, buried again in church archives. History moved on. The obelisk rose in its new home, its pagan roots erased, its Christian identity proclaimed. But something always lingers, even today, on hot afternoons, when the square is mostly quiet. Some say the stone feels warm to the touch, not from the sun above, but from something older below. Asterisk, asterisk. Yet the physical legacy of the obelisk was not the only thing buried. There was a story, passed down in fragments, never quite proven, that the original placement of the obelisk by Caligula had not been purely symbolic. According to a 4th century Alexandrian chronicle, preserved only in Coptic and seldom cited in the West. There was a belief among Egyptian priests that obelisks were not merely monuments. They were markers of divine geometry. That is, they weren't placed randomly. They stood on specific nodes of solar alignment, points where the earth and sun were said to be in spiritual harmony, and when moved, they had to be realigned. If Caligula's engineers had followed this practice, whether knowingly or as part of imperial superstition, then the original base of the obelisk would have been set according to some ancient pattern, perhaps even aligned with the rising sun on a particular date, the equinox, or a festival date of Ra when Sixtus moved it. That alignment was broken. The new placement was dictated by visual balance, not ancient solar codes. The stone was raised before the basilica as a trophy, but its shadow no longer moved in harmony with anything sacred, and perhaps that mattered more than the Pope knew, because while the physical presence of the obelisk dominated the square, its spiritual geometry had been shattered. Some modern scholars of archaeoastronomy Study of ancient astronomical knowledge have suggested that the obelisk's original placement on the Vatican Hill, long before the basilica, may have corresponded with sunset over Janiculum Hill during certain festivals, that its shadow would have pointed directly toward a shrine, now lost, where prisoners were prepared for execution. In this view, the obelisk wasn't just a landmark, it was a sundial of fate, a cosmic timer, marking the transition from light to death. A daily reckoning. Asterisk, asterisk, even now. The Vatican obelisk holds one more secret, something rarely mentioned. At its very peak, above the bronze cross, above the gilded sphere, is a small capsule. Almost no one notices it. It's roughly the size of an orange and made of bronze. Inside, sealed for centuries, it's a relic, but not a relic of Peter, not a relic of Christ, a relic of Julius Caesar. That is the legend. Pope Sixtus, according to an obscure Vatican account written by his archivist in 1590, ordered that a fragment of Caesar's ashes, believed to have been preserved in the ruins of his temple in the Roman Forum, be sealed within the bronze orb at the obelisk's tip. Why? Because Caesar, too, claimed descent from Venus, because he, too, represented an old divine order, and because, in Sixtus's strange theology, all things, even pagan emperors, must eventually serve Christ. It was a symbolic triumph. The old empire, the sun gods, even Caesar himself, all of it now subordinated to the authority of the cross. The obelisk had become a ladder of victory, from Egyptian stone to Roman blood to Christian glory. And yet if you visit St. Peter's Square at dawn, when the crowds are still asleep and the sky is beginning to shift into light, it's a moment just before sunrise when the obelisk seems to pull the sunlight toward itself. The air feels thinner, the cobblestones begin to glow, and the shadow stretches westward, back toward the place where Peter was buried, back toward the hill where martyrs died unnamed, back toward the Circus Spina, where the bones were once uncovered. It's not magic, not exactly, but it's memory. The memory of a place where death, devotion, empire, and silence all intersect. A place where a stone from the Nile still speaks, not with words, but with weight. A place where the past is not behind you, up, under your feet, your feet. There are places on earth where human memory gathers like water, at the lowest point, slow, heavy, and persistent. The Vatican Hill is one of them, and though tourists shuffle across the square each day, few ever realize they're walking across a design older than the basilica itself, a design invisible to the eye, but legible if you know how to look. Beneath the Piazza San Pietro, beneath the geometric symmetry, Bernini, perfected in the 17th century, there lies something stranger than elegance, a forgotten map, not of roads or buildings, but of lines, alignments, shadows, and death. Some scholars of sacred geometry believe that the obelisk in the center of the square wasn't just a centerpiece for the new Christian order, but a pivot point that had been preserved for far longer, an axis of something ancient. The Egyptians called it the benban. The Romans still treated obelisks as more than stone. They were talismans of imperial conquest, yes, but also instruments for mapping space and time, tools of empire and ritual. And when Caligula ordered this one transported from Heliopolis to his pleasure gardens on Vatican Hill, he didn't place it arbitrarily. No, according to a fragmentary document unearthed in the 1800s, attributed to an architect in Caligula's court named Gaius Licinius Thales, the obelisk's orientation had been calculated using celestial measurements. The text, barely preserved on crumbling parchment, reads, "The shadow shall fall longest upon the feast of the goddess. There a line is to be drawn, and under this line no man shall speak again." It's a cryptic statement, but what scholars deduced is that the obelisk was positioned so its shadow on certain festival days would point directly at specific locations, possibly altars or underground chambers or execution sites. Some believe the Feast of the Goddess refers to the festival of Isis, which had gained popularity in Rome during the 1st century. If true, then the alignment might have had ritual significance, a fusion of Egyptian sun worship and Roman spectacle. This suggests that the Vatican Hill, even before it became the seat of the church, was already a stage for orchestrated belief, a place where time, light, and death were choreographed. And this map, drawn in shadow and stone, did not disappear when the church took control. It merely changed hands. In 1948, during excavations under St. Peter's Basilica to strengthen the foundations of Bernini's baldacchino, the great bronze canopy over the papal altar, workers uncovered something unusual. Not a grave, not a relic, floor, but not the floor of a Roman villa or necropolis. This was older, stranger. The floor was made of basalt and laid out in a curious radial pattern, not unlike the spokes of a wheel. At its center was a circular stone, cracked but still solid, with faint carvings. No Latin, no Greek. They resembled carvoglyphs. What was a floor with Egyptian symbols doing beneath the high altar of the Vatican? The archaeologists were cautious. They preserved the site, recorded it, King quickly sealed it again, citing safety concerns for the structure above. But one of the lead researchers, Belgian epigrapher named Dr. Emily Van Tel, believed they had found the remains of a ritual platform, possibly predating the Circus of Caligula. She published a short paper before her death, suggesting that the Vatican Hill may have hosted a small temple or shrine built by Alexandrian merchants or Roman soldiers devoted to Isis and Serapis, a place for private rites, midnight observances, a kind of urban mystery cult center, hidden in plain sight. Her paper was largely ignored, but what she described matched certain unusual features found on the Vatican obelisk itself, specifically the unusual bronze lions that once flanked its base when it stood at the circus. They were not Roman in style. They were Ptolemaic, Egyptian, but not ancient. A fusion. Why does that matter? Because it suggests a deliberate transmission of meaning. The Vatican Hill may not have been merely a convenient place for spectacle and execution. It may have been sacred long before Peter, long before Nero, perhaps long before the name Rome even meant anything beyond a few huts on the Palatine. There's another thread to consider. In the early 3rd century, a Christian writer named Hippolytus, later declared a heretic, described a curious rumor in his Refutation of All Heresies. He claimed that Simon Magus, the sorcerer who tried to buy divine power from the apostles, had established a rival shrine on the Vatican Hill, a place where his followers conducted dark rituals and where Simon claimed to ascend to the heavens. The church, of course, dismissed this as heresy. But what if the rumor was based on an older truth, not about Simon, but about the hill itself, that it was already associated with mystical rites, vertical ascension, and cosmic alignment, that when Peter was executed here, it was not random, it was symbolic, a statement of power, the apostle of Christ, dying in the shadow of a monument to Ra, a crucifixion, beneath the obelisk, a death aligned with the axis of empire and eternity. And when Constantine built the first basilica here in the 4th century, he knew this. He didn't build it despite the obelisk. He built it around the memory of its shadow, a Christian basilica over a pagan axis, not to erase it, but to claim it, to overwrite one sacred geometry with another. Today, the Vatican obelisk stands quietly at the center of the square. Tourists pass by, cameras click. Children feed the pigeons, but few notice the markers on the pavement. They look decorative, small bronze discs embedded in the stone. Each bears the name of a wind or a direction, like Ponente or Levante. It's part of a meridian, a sundial. It's a fact. designed by astronomer Ignazio Danti in the late 16th century. At noon, the obelisk's shadow touches these markers. A tells time. But the meridian is not modern. It's a continuation. A is a subtle nod to the obelisk's original role. It's a needle in the fabric of the cosmos. And if you follow the shadow long enough, if you chart its path across the centuries, it leads not just to the basilica, it leads to memory, to all that was buried before the church existed. A temple to Isis, a Roman execution trench, a forgotten shrine to Serapis, a sunlit path across the bones of saints and strangers, a map etched not on parchment, but in light and silence. So the next time you see the Vatican on television or walk its square at dusk, pause just for a moment. Look not at the basilica. Look at the shadow. It has been pointing for thousands of years. We just forgot what it was trying to show us. Asterisk. Good night.